we're also in the same room, but thank you so much for those who managed to come in. You're welcome, thank you. And those who managed to join us online, thank you so much. We would like to record this seminar, if you don't mind. My name is Nhlanhla Sebilimbata. I'm going to be your host. So one of the ISER's 4 research areas is in human and economic development. And our discussion on human well-being falls in this broad area. This presentation is on a recently published book titled Quality of Life and Human Well-being in Sub Saharan Africa, Prospects for Future Happiness series. Human well-being research and policy making. Quite a mouthful. But in short, the study provides vital insights to guide practitioners and policymakers as it retraces the largely untold history of well-being in Africa, highlights the success stories and progress of our age, and looks to the future well-being of Sub-Saharan Africa. With a focus on the youth, the authors discuss the clash of the generations, exploring the disconnect between Africa's youth bulge and Asian leaders. It is my great pleasure to introduce our presenters, Valerie Muller, who is Professor Emeritus of Quality of Life Studies at Rhodes University. She studied sociology and earned her PhD from the University of Zurich in Switzerland. She worked at the University of Zimbabwe, UKZN, and was director of the ISER from 1998 to 2006. Talking about passing on the baton from the older generation to the younger generation. In her work, she pioneered the first quality of life and social indicator studies that have tracked South African life, satisfaction and happiness from apartheid to the country's transition to democracy. With her, Benjamin Roberts, who is research director and acting strategic lead in the developmental, capable and ethical state research division at the Human Sciences Research Council. He's also a coordinator of the South African Social Attitude Survey, SASAS, since its inception in 2003. He received his PhD in Social Policy and Labor Studies from Rhodes University's ISER. So we are coming back. His research interests and areas and expertise include attitudinal measurement and social change, subjective well-being and quality of life, poverty and inequality, and social cohesion. And then we'll have Thomas Salmon responding to their presentation. Thomas is currently a doctoral researcher at Rhodes University. His PhD explores the pathways through which teachers become knowledge producers and agents of change for societal development and transformation. He has a master's degree from the University of Sussex in Education and International Development. He's also a community activist working in the Eastern Cape on open government and COVID-19 communication and food security issues at the local municipality level. So how the seminar is going to work is that I will allow for the presenters to do their presentations a little bit long. It's going to be about 40 minutes. And then I will ask Ben to respond very, very, very shortly, less than 10 minutes. This will then also be followed by questions and comments. I'll start off with the people online. So as the presenters are talking, please note your comments and questions in the chat box. and then we will be reading those. If there are not too many, we will allow people to come on the platform live and sort of present their own questions. Have I missed something out there? No. So we're going to go straight to the presentations, but I just need to make sure that Tamrin, do you have the presentation?
I do, and I'm currently sharing.
Fantastic. Okay.
Everyone should be able to see it. Please alert me if not.
All right. Okay. So I think Ben, you can. Will you be able to trace where she is on the?
Yes, I think so.
And then you can just say next.
I'll just say next.
So Tamrin, they'll just say next, and then you sort of like go on for the audience online.
Okay, great.
Fantastic. Thank you. Over to you, presenters. Next.
So I'm starting off. I'm Valerie, and I'm very pleased to be able to thank you very much for inviting us to share our book with you this afternoon. The Prospects for Future Happiness in Sub-Saharan Africa, our book, had a long gestation period. It's a culmination of almost a decade of work together. Ben and I have been working together for that time. It all started with the Halloran Foundation on the left of your screen supported a project that entrusted quality of life researchers to imagine the world we all like to live in. And two colleagues of ours, they were very senior in quality of life research, they were interested in advances in well-being. So they took it on with the Halloran support to produce a book on the pursuit of human well-being, the untold global history, as Professor Bhatt has told us. In between, Ben contributed to a world global happiness handbook, and we also contributed to a chapter on waiting for, in the World Happiness Report, on waiting for happiness in Africa. And this is the story that we're going to continue. The aims of our book.
Next.
Oh, sorry, I forget the next. I've been clicking myself. Sorry about that.
Okay, I'm going.
Oh, you haven't even done the next one.
No, that's just now.
Oh, you did.
It's there.
Thank you very much. Right, so I'll continue. Now, the aims of our book are as follows. First of all, we wanted to cast a more positive lens on Sub-Saharan Africa, but with no sugarcoating. We also wanted to strike a balance. We wanted to avoid Afro-pessimism, but not gloss over the many challenges facing Africa. And you'll hear that Ben will be telling you more about these. We wanted to showcase homegrown African initiatives to measure human well-being and monitor progress, because up to now it had been done from outside. So these new homegrown initiatives include the Afrobarometer and also the Abraham Foundation's Good Government Index. Next, please. Our book is now in 3 parts. The first part retraces the largely undocumented history in order to learn from the past so we can imagine the future. The book documents the success story of our age, progress as well as challenges. The third part looks to the future to foretell a new African dawn, as we hope. In the process, in the book, our work, we found there was so much evidence of Sub-Saharan Africa's remarkable resilience over time, going back to way back in time. Next, please. The first part locates Sub-Saharan Africa on the globe, and this is for any international readers who sort of think very often that Africa is one country. Then we document how well-being is cost and sowing in Sub-Saharan Africa. We look back in time how African well-being over centuries was achieved, and we also were interested in traditional ideas of what people at the time might have thought of the good life, how you achieve the good life. The last chapter just briefly thinks about Africa, war and peace. Next, please. Can you make the next? Thank you. We put Sub-Saharan Africa on the map on the right, and as we all know here in Africa, that we are the cradle of humankind. All our ancestors from around the world come from this continent. In prehistory, the continent spread off from Asia and Americas. It was the time of Gondwanaland, and there are 49 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, with close on 1 billion people living there. We have the world's greatest language and genetic diversity. We also have diversity of flora and fauna. And as you see, even in Nigeria, we have more than 3,000 languages spoken and many dialects across the continent. So Africa is a patchwork of countries, and each has its own ancient history, which of course made our task much more difficult. Next, please. Now, the idea is that you might have kings in history and all the monarchies, but the struggles of ordinary people against the forces of nature and the cruelty of men, this is the pure, they are the heroes in history. African people have survived times of feast and famine, slavery, colonialism, exploitation, and we thought that such experiences will have shaped African myths of origin, of self-esteem that people have, and values and also aspirations for the good life. Next, please. So we wondered, we came to the pursuit of well-being from ancient times. We looked at the roots of many African values and virtues, and we thought that they would be embedded in indigenous religions, and they would have nurtured well-being over time. On the right, you see we've got kinship, and an African artist, he created Ubuntu as a circle of wisdom. So values would include community cohesiveness, an egalitarian ethic, and the idea of African humanists, which we know as Ubuntu. It's also important to note that many technological advances actually bypassed Africa owing to its isolation. Some of these advances proved unsuitable to the local climate and to the habitat, and some were adapted. But Africa's isolation way back in its climatic conditions tended to favor conservatism, but also self-reliance to cope with any adversities that they experienced. Next, please. Now, this is a short walk through Africa's long history to independence. It starts with the 1960s. It was the beginning of the first dance of freedoms, the wind of Africa coming through Africa. Then in the 19th century, we had the Scramble for Africa, which created the borders that we still have today, which cut across language, ethnicity, and the ancient polities. And many countries are landlocked, which is a great disadvantage. In the 60s to the 80s, we had the period of nation building, and many experiments in economic development. It was also the time of coups and regime change. In the 90s was the age of the new democracies in Sub-Saharan Africa, if in name only. We also had the problems that were created by structural adjustment, which held back social services. We had the Cold War, and more recently, the War on Terror. Next, please. We're going to continue with Africa's long walk since independence. In the 2000s, there were regular multi-party elections, but that was along with violent election campaigns, for example, in Kenya in 2007. It was also the time of patronage politics and the corruption, which kept many authoritarian leaders in power beyond constitutional term limits. Then in the 2010s, the Arab Spring moved across the Sahel down to southern Africa. And we'll see there was shown in the picture is the regime change in Burkina Faso and the other countries that we documented, for example, the Gambia, and also was the last one that we documented in our book was after 30 years, Al-Shabir in Sudan. Next, please. Now, indicators for Africa. Well, Africa has a long history, but most of its history has been transmitted orally, or it's captured in its fossils and its monuments that are in stone. The first written documents were compiled all by outsiders. They were explorers, missionaries, colonial administrators, who of course had a completely different view than the people living in Africa. And similarly, Africa's social indicators were initially collected by global initiatives, and for instance, the World Bank and Ghana. And it's only in recent times that we have local initiatives to collect our own indicators. And Afrobarometer looks at well-being, a proxy indicator of well-being, the lived poverty, which measures not what is, what isn't bad, and democracy. And then I've mentioned the Ibrahim Index of Good Governance. Next, please. Throughout history, Africa has been very resilient. I've mentioned it's lived through many times adversities, slavery, colonialization, exploitation. But foragers in Africa survived longer than elsewhere because there were technical advances which were important for that time, such as the weighting, as simple as a weighted digging scheme, which increased food security, which is very important. But for centuries, Africa's population lagged behind other world regions. The reason being that Africa has always been exposed to extreme weather and climate change, which we are experiencing at the moment. It's not new. But importantly, we also have to know that slavery deprived Africa of the many hands that were needed to produce food, to increase food security. As a result, Africa's population remained stagnant, while populations in Europe and, say, in the Americas were increasing. It's only in recent times that Africa has experienced a population explosion. Today, Africa is the most youthful continent, and this raises the question of how to turn youth wealth into a demographic dividend. Next, please. I'll now hand over to Ben.
Thank you, Valerie. So part 2 of the book is really the heart of the indicators that Valerie referred to. It speaks to the basic needs and well-being of across the 49 countries. It addresses future African generations and patterns of well-being. It looks at human rights and well-being amongst the Sub Saharan minorities, as well as innovations that have are beginning to enhance quality of life across the continent. It also reflects on quite critically around issues of democracy, good governance, as well as the promise of prosperity. Next slide. So if we look at social progress since the 1960s, the wind of change that Valerie talked about that swept through the continent during that decade fundamentally raised expectations for the publics around across the continent for particular material benefits associated with freedom. In the volume, we examined the classic human development indicators become associated with the Millennium Development Goals and more recently the Sustainable Development Goals. And those include a range of measures pertaining to health, to education, as well as economic progress. What we found were significant gains in well-being, particularly related to the dimensions of health and education. For instance, there's been spectacular and fairly rapid gains in African longevity. Life expectancy, in fact, doubled in a couple of generations, despite prevalent warfare and despite various epidemics such as the HIV/AIDS, Ebola, and more recently the COVID-19 pandemics. It's important to note, and that's why we've got these graphics, is that the achievements do tend to be misrepresented by the global north. Some of the examples include the disproportionate fear following the Ebola outbreaks earlier in the previous decade, as well as the discovery of the Omicron variant by South African scientists. And really the images are shown just convey that sense of misrepresentation. Next slide. So this slide, we really show those changes in life expectancy in Sub-Saharan Africa's more populous countries. over an 80-year period covering 1940 through to 2020. What the graph does is really starkly convey the strong improvements that have been achieved in life expectancy throughout the region over this period. And it actually represents a 20 to 30-year gain in longevity for all the countries that are displayed on the graph. Next slide. In the educational domain, we see similar impressive strides. The slide showcases the gains in literacy amongst those aged 15 years and older in Africa, compared to Europe, China, and the global average. In this instance, we look at a particularly longer sweep of history, as you can see, capturing trends over an almost 150-year period from 1870 through to 2014. In 1870, only 4% of the continent's population was literate. By 1950, this increased marginally to around 15%. Ever since, we've seen significant improvements, reaching 2/3 by the late 2010s. So we are progressively, as a continent, catching up to the rest of the world. Next slide. With regard to female literacy rates, there have been appreciable gains in literacy over time, with more than 70% of women literate in a sizable number of countries, and that's the green shaded cluster in the top right-hand quadrant of the graph. However, despite this, female literacy across the continent remains a particular challenge, and around 3/5 of all the literate persons in the region are women. In 15 countries in the region, the female literacy rate falls below the 50% mark. That's all those falling to the left of that vertical dashed line. The situation in the red shaded cluster in the bottom left-hand quadrant is particularly alarming. In this case, the literacy rate for women falls below 30%. So the cases include Chad, Guinea, Mali, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan. The big message from this is the prospects of a rapid change in the cases are unlikely to materialize, particularly given that what we see, it's not shown in this image, but we find the same general patterns are reflected amongst young, this gap between men and women, and the general lag over time. We find it replicated amongst 15 to 24-year-old women. So it really is going to take a long time to bootstrap the bottom up towards the top left-hand side. Next slide. Focusing now on recognition for minorities, we find that since independence, a majority of Sub-Saharan African citizens have tended to enjoy greater freedom from poverty, oppression, and neglect. Yet there are still a number of minority groups whose needs are overlooked and to various degrees have their dignity compromised. Perhaps some of the more positive stories are amongst women. We see new role models coming out. Examples include the Liberian President, Sirleaf. We see quotas for women parliamentarians increasing. South Africa is a good example, Rwanda too. We also see support for women and small business entrepreneurs coming through across the continent. For young women, we see that child marriages in several countries have now been banned and are indeed declining. We also see new coming-of-age ceremonies that exclude female genital mutilation. Amongst refugees, just the resounding message there, despite the South African perhaps exceptionalism in this regard, South Africa does tend to look after many of the world's refugees and displaced persons. In terms of LGBTIQ, colonial penal codes punishing homosexual acts and discriminating against LGBTIQ+ are being reversed. And for example, in Angola, homophobia continues to exist, but homosexual acts are not punished, going to be punished punitively in the future. Decolonization, I think, has obviously been something that South Africa has been very vocal on in the last decade in particular. And particularly with the youth lens and the youth mobilization around this. But also there's a movement around recognition of African indigenous skills increasingly, and also the valuing of recognition of African indigenous languages as a resource enhancing early learning opportunities. So there's a lot that can be said there, and maybe in the Q&A we can talk a bit more about that. Next slide. This is a very important slide. This is fundamentally about trends in the demand for, as well as the supply of democracy. The graphs represent 12 African countries in particular that have been part of the Afrobarometer series across the last 2 decades. What it shows is that, firstly, alongside the complex patterns of progress and reversal that have occurred following the democratic experiments that occurred in Africa since the 1990s, we do still find a very, very resolute public appetite for democracy. The left-hand figure on the slide shows the demand for democracy across successive rounds of the Afrobarometer survey series. It shows that Africans consider democracy to be preferable to any form of government, rejecting authoritarian alternatives, including one-partyism, military rule, and one-man rule. There's a similar support also that comes through for constitutional limits to terms of office. About 3/4 of the public across the continent represented in the survey do support those limits. These beliefs really do convey a deeply rooted demand for democracy, as well as an appreciation of the benefits that it brings to citizens. They represent a trend that has remained relatively resilient since the inception of the Afrobarometer survey series in the late 90s. Despite this good news, there are certain worrying aspects about this commitment or the demand for democracy. Nearly 2/5, or just over 40%, both agree that democracy is preferable and reject big man politics, the one-party rule, and the military rule. So the rise of authoritarian tendencies is a significant concern for the future of Sub-Saharan Africa, as it is for the globe in recent years too. Just also to say that from a South African perspective, there's been a very strong decline, very sharp, in the demand for democracy in the last decade, falling from 72% in the 2011 to 13 period to only 40% saying democracy is preferable in the latest round of Afrobarometer in 2019 to 21. We are the second lowest across the continent after Angola. So South Africa is going through its own moment in relation to these trends. The right-hand figure shows satisfaction with the supply of democracy. And on average, we find that the public evaluations of the supply of democracy in the region tend to be far more critical in nature than the demand for democracy. So democracy is not matching up to the expectations or the promise of democracy across these nations. There have been fluctuations over the 2 decades that Afrobarometer measures on this range. And the share of citizens that view their country as a full democracy, and this is the orange line, or democracy with minor flaws, stood at rather middling levels across the region over the period. So, next slide. This slide, still focusing on the supply of or satisfaction with democracy. What this slide really conveys is that citizen beliefs about whether they're being supplied with democracy in practice really diverge very substantially across Sub-Saharan Africa. We look at the orange bars, and I've ranked it across countries from high to low in the orange bars. We find an astounding 73 percentage point difference between the highest satisfaction ratings in Tanzania and the lowest satisfaction levels in Uganda. This actually has increased from the 54% gap in 2011-13 from Afrobarometer. So this inequality in satisfaction ratings is growing over time. Next slide. One of the main messages is that, drawing from this democratic evaluations, is that it's firstly that there have been various ebbs and flows. You saw the changing nature of those line trends. We see ebbs and flows in democracy in the region over time, but a majority do still consider democracy to be preferable to any form of government, according to the Afrobarometer series. However, the supply of democracy really doesn't match up to the demand for it in many cases. And this is why we see spillover effects such as the rise of protest politics and so on. Various democracy scholars have particularly latch onto the idea of dissatisfied Democrats, and that they may actually provide to be a particularly positive force for change. So the emergence of critical and quite assertive citizens that demand accountability and try to keep democracy in check. We also found that the freedom from poverty is as important as political freedoms. So this is the difference between substantive or fit democracy as put and thin or procedural democracy. Citizens are increasingly asking what democracy can deliver for them. So it's not only about the rights and freedoms being in place, it's about what does it deliver the fundamental things that citizens expect of democratic life and democracy. Next slide. So now we look at issues around infrastructure. And infrastructure emerges as a critically important factor for happiness in Africa, we are in the book. And good governance particularly produces material benefits of democracy, and by extension, better infrastructure makes a difference to patterns of quality of life in Africa. Conversely, a lack of infrastructure could pose a substantial threat to the success of African democracy. Next slide. One of the things that, as I said earlier, it reflects a global pattern is the issue around authoritarianism. Africa has a particular challenge with issues of third termism, as we call it, but also there's this slippery slope towards authoritarianism. And particularly in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a global recession in democracy. And particularly as we've seen with the rise across different world regions, we've seen a rise, growing rise of authoritarian tendencies. South Africa is not immune to that. Sorry, Africa as a whole. There is a recent rise in authoritarian rule across the globe and in Africa. So Africa's big men may actually be a legacy of colonial rule, certain scholars have found. The colonial era really strengthened and consolidated the power of particular political leaders over their communities. It undermined checks and balances in African societies, and by extension, institutionalized particularly repressive forms of government. Africa's big men have tended to have particularly poor human rights records. They use repressive measures, and they tend to stay in power through forms of clientelism, through cronyism, through nepotism, as well as rent-seeking practices. Authoritarian leaders have also provided political stability and support for fighting the war on terror, and they also attract foreign aid and investment. And that's particularly the case for one of the longest reigning leaders in Africa, Chad's President Deby. Next slide. Continuing this idea of third termism, there have been recent examples of trying to abolish term limits. So Rwanda, for instance, Rwanda's President Kagame claims that strong leadership provides political stability and economic development. It is also a far more efficient form of democracy. Brexit leader countries also serve as so-called political godfathers for African leaders. So President Xi Jinping, China's president for life, has no term limits. He's often described as a gift to African despots. And Russian leader Vladimir Putin started his fourth term in office in 2018. Next slide. So this in particular is probably very difficult to read, but it's just a schematic. I would say focus on the blue shaded components. It gives a sense of the length of time in office for some of Africa's big men. Some of the length of time heads of state were in office in Sub-Saharan Africa over the conveys 1960 through to 2020. And obviously, we have a certain cut-off period, but most of the big, with one or two exceptions, most of the big men that are still in blue at the end of the 2020 period remain in power. So we see some that have been in power for more than 4 decades. Next slide. Corruption in Africa's big men. What we see in relation to this is that 58% of people around the continent believe that corruption increased in the past year. Under a third approve of the government's fight against corruption. And over time, happiness tends to be far higher in countries that have less perceived corruption that are more positively seen to be doing something about the fight against corruption. So there is a strong correlation between corrupt practices and unhappiness and the degree to which governments are trying to address the problem. Next slide. In terms of Africa's big men and what issues related to Afro uprising, in 2016 we saw Africa's youth really coming out and protesting against aging presidents who tend to cling to power. Around the time, Afrobarometer reported 11% of youth, so more than a tenth, were involved in various forms of protest action in the year prior to survey. Social media, in particular, has been a critical factor in mobilizing youth in relation to this widespread protest action. Next slide. So let's look at some of the mobile cell tendencies. I think this is particularly important. What we see is that over time, and I think South Africa is a great example on this slide, is this rapid increase in the penetration of cellular telephones. South Africa has always been far ahead of the global average on this. But other parts of the continent, such as Kenya, is increasing. In the last year, it overtook the global average. But other parts of the continent, such as the DRC, remain around the 40 to 45% range. It's stagnating a little bit. And we see that even at this continental average is fairly stagnant in the last 5 years. South Africa is clearly a leader, and we saw that in the Fees Forum protesting of the mid-2010s. Next slide. Continuing this theme, what we see is that many African leaders grew up before the mobile phone age. Some have tried to migrate to it with different degrees of success. But Africa definitely leapfrogged earlier technological advances to embrace mobile phones. Cell phones have become a routine part of everyday life. Acquiring a cell phone often features as a fundamental rite of passage for Africa's youth. In the 21st century, mobile telephone technologies improve the quality of life across many domains, including health, finance, education, as well as family and social relations. Mobile phones have also played an important role in mobilizing, as we said before, mobilizing youth protests against African leaders who abolished term limits. So I think that's critically important. On the next slide, what we can see, this book is a very good example, is the Arab Spring, where youth protests all started with that Arab Spring in Tunisia that led to the first regime change in 2011. Some democracy scholars refer to that as a particular wave of democracy, led championed by the youth. The protests subsequently rippled down the continent. One particular political analyst has referred to the season of protests likely hitched a ride on the Sahara's Hamakin wind that blows south every November and blew across the continent. In 2019, there was a second wave of the Arab Spring in Algeria. The youth uprising toppled the president's Bouteflika, who sought a fifth term in office. Algerian youth protest slogans invoked clearly the memory of their country's war of independence against colonial France. In turn, Sudanese youth were inspired by their Algerian counterparts and demonstrated against President al-Bashir's 30-year rule when he finally stepped down in April 2019. This slide. So youth have always been at the forefront of protests. The protests that followed the Arab Spring have been interpreted fundamentally as a clash between generations. The governments reacted against these youth politics, these youth protests, by shutting down social media, recognizing the influence that this medium was now having on mobilizing this young generation. In 2016 alone, the internet was shut down no fewer than 54 times in 27 African countries. And the longest was Chad's 16-month ban on social media. Since that time, Chad's president, Idris Deby, who was in power since 2019, he was toppled in 2021, but subsequently, unfortunately, has been replaced by his son. So a continuation of this neo-patrimonial politics. Next slide. So what are the risk factors for discontent? And I think this is speaking to the recent politics in particular. One of them is price increases, particularly large inflationary increases of basic commodities such as the daily bread. Food prices are fundamental. Other things are such as fuel and transportation costs. We've seen how rapidly that's happening in South Africa, as well as other parts of the continent and globally. But also, it's really hitting hard on the basic cost of living, particularly for those who live on things like paraffin, for lighting and other uses in informal settlements and other places. Extreme weather and climate change has also been a driver of discontent, as well as youth unemployment, the challenges related to that. Youngsters coming through with expectations. We saw the increasing levels of education, but it's not translating into higher levels of employment. So that's also a huge risk factor for discontent. Next slide. Other factors that can fuel uprisings, so these are just some examples, so I won't spend too much time there, but the examples relate to what I've just said. Bread prices, extreme weather and climate change again, so examples in Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe there. COVID-19 restrictions was a good example, so pandemic and pandemic-related policy and restrictions and regulations can also play a role there, as well as issues such as commodity prices and the dependence on that. We saw the reverberating effect of the war in Ukraine on things like cooking oil, on issues like fuel, and other cereals such as wheat. It's creating a huge challenge across the continent. So I'm going to hand back to Valerie to talk a bit more about the youth-related issues coming from the book.
The next slide.
Africa's population.
Yes, that's
Okay. All right. The Africa's population time bomb is a real concern in Africa because population may double by 2050 starting. And in Africa, we have the top 25 fertility rates. Niger is leading this respect with 6.7 births per woman in 2021. And at the time we were writing, it was above 7. But in contrary, that one of the reasons for this is that there is apparently a high ideal family size, that people want to have large families, whereas in other parts of the world, say in South America or in India, the transition has moved on and we haven't reached that yet. We also have, which also accelerates fertility rates, is that there are unmet needs for contraception and for family planning that women might want and have access to. Meanwhile, Africa's youth lack employment opportunities despite the greater education levels that Ben has pointed out in the indicators. Next slide, please. So, African youth have been on the move, voting with their feet for a better life. And a third of Africans in 34 countries told Afrobarometer in the round 7 that they considering emigrating. And it was particularly young male and more educated youth that wanted to escape poverty or escape from economic hardship. Now, what was interesting we learned from Afrobarometer is that these youth, most of them, wanted to look for destinations for a better life in their own region or elsewhere in Africa. And this was particularly true among Southern African immigrants. They were most likely to want to stay within their region or in the continent, whereas West African youth were more likely to consider emigrating to Europe or to the Americas. And we had a story there, which I won't go into, the back way, that young villagers in the Gambia, where they have an authoritarian leader, they are willing to risk going to Europe, across the Sahara and across the Mediterranean. What youth found, and they told Afrobarometer, is that crossing borders was very difficult. So that was one of the reasons keeping them back from finding, opportunities in neighboring countries. And so they followed this up in the next round, and a minority said that crossing borders was easy, very easy. So there may be hope for the future, because this year, the new African Continental Free Trade Agreement aims to connect Africans across 54 African countries. So it may be that it'll be easier to cross borders, not only for goods and supply chains, but also for people to find a better life elsewhere if they can't find it at home. Next, please. There is a problem in Africa. If you look at the right, the most important problems that African countries face is unemployment. And in Afrobarometer surveys, Africans always say they want their government to address the unemployment problem. They would like decent work and economic growth, which is Sustainable Development Goal 8. Because there is a mismatch, a large proportion of the population, of the youth population, make up 60%, but they only 30% may be in the labor force. So this is a real problem, a tension that we have in Africa. Greg Mills, who's a consultant to governments across Africa, he's said that ministers he meets say their strategy is jobs, 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 but it is very difficult to create jobs. It's not that easy. Creating jobs is an output of better policies, improved governance and higher growth, but it's not a strategy in themselves. And as we've seen in South Africa, the government has been struggling for very many years to create jobs for our youth. Next, please. So what do we do to put the youth bulge to work? And so in our book, we report some hopeful scenarios that there are maybe concerted efforts to create the jobs that are needed to stall youth immigration. Because by 2015, more than 1 billion young people will be looking for jobs. Now, one scenario sees the continent diversifying from only extractive industries to invest in its youth. And if business-friendly policies were introduced, maybe production from developing countries, including China, might shift to Africa. And of course, there is always the problem of neocolonialism that one might be a concern. Next, please. As far as homegrown solutions, job solutions are concerned, they're Nigeria's richest businessman, Aliko Dangote. He hopes to transform his country's stagnant economy. He's invested in job-generating industries throughout the continent, and he's also initiated projects that will upskill youth to take on such jobs in education, health, and empowerment. Ethiopia, at the time that Abiy came to power, aimed to create 16 modern industrial parks. And I thought it was very interesting that the idea was to revitalize its traditional textile industry. And we know Africa has wonderful textiles. I mean, Ghana their textiles are stunning. And in Zambia, it launched agribusiness project, which aims to assist subsistence farmers and small agribusinesses. And the aim is to boost productivity, also to improve supply chains, which we've seen during the COVID period have become a problem, and access to markets. Next, please. Youth leaders of tomorrow. Now, as you know, Rhodes is the place where leaders learn, and many other places are needed to assist young leaders of tomorrow. There is skill trainings that will be essential if Africa's youth will be entering the modern economy. There's a need for life skills, finance, practical, technical skills, including STEM skills, which are in science, technology, and engineering, mathematics. Entrepreneur skills. Entrepreneurs will play a pivotal role in creating jobs for youth. And here in South Africa, WITS has an entrepreneurship clinic. Smart job creators. At the time of writing, the Hult Prize Challenge for students who present smart ideas that will change the world for the better, create thousands of meaningful jobs. It went to chemistry students here at Rhodes. And in Ghana, we have an influencer who hopes to groom 3 million young African leaders of tomorrow through a leadership academy. So there are ideas to help youth to get access to jobs and to maybe create jobs themselves. Next, please. During the COVID period, we also saw that youth have agency. There were lots of youth initiatives that were ongoing to help people to cope with the virus. For instance, in Sudan, the youth had been at the forefront of topping al-Bashir. They wanted to keep their new democracy on track. So they took the initiative of spreading or supporting the fight against the COVID and keeping the restrictions in place, distributing supplies to the poor in communities. So they took a real leadership role. They did what the government couldn't do at the time. And in Cape Town, a very interesting thing happened. Gang leaders held a truce and they joined forces to distribute donated food parcels to their communities. Of course, we don't know if this truce will hold post-COVID, but we hope maybe it will. In Ghana, a network of educated women wanted to share their education with other people who were less privileged, so they broadcast health messages in the local dialect to be able to spread the knowledge to many people in rural areas who otherwise wouldn't receive this knowledge. Next, please. So in Africa, there's always been something new out of Africa. And as you see in the picture, what a great idea. This is a book on awesome African inventions. In the past, as I mentioned in the beginning, some innovations were ill-suited to Africa. For instance, horses that came in the 1500s, they just died because they couldn't live there. The wheel was impractical due to repetition. But how today, practical innovations that affect everyday life are important, they are accepted, and they're not vanity ones. A big example is actually Kenya's mobile banking system. Money transfer system, which was born of necessity in Kenya, is now active in 90 countries globally, and you will even find a banking system in places like Somalia too, which helps people to send remittances to each other because it's a problem. We just mentioned the book Other Innovations That Make Life Better. Across many life domains, they also take Africa to the world. Examples are African drones that deliver blood supplies, or they track where the malaria is stemming. Vaccine development, as Ben has mentioned, across malaria, Ebola, even in very difficult times in the DRC, HIV/AIDS, and now COVID. We're going to produce our own vaccines. We just hope there will be some uptake. And last one, we also wanted projects, innovations that inspire all. So Africans are looking into space. We have the largest radio telescope in Africa, the SKA, and recently our own scientists have participated in recent black hole research. And the next few slides will be about black holes. May I have the next slide, please? Now, cosmologist Stephen Hawking, the well-known, he died about 2 years ago. He warns youth about black holes. He says it's a bad idea to fall into a black hole in the book that he wrote for youth. So the reason is because black holes are one-way doors out of our universe. There's no coming back, so you don't want to fall into one. And the reason the black hole has an event horizon where gravity is just strong enough, it drags the light back, so it prevents it from escaping. That's what will happen to you if you fall into a black hole. So it's much safer to look up in awe at the image of the Milky Way black hole, which was captured this year by the Event Horizon Telescope, the EHT. And that's in the picture you see. At the left is the black hole, down below is one of the antennas, the meerkat, and above it is the Milky Way. So, and this is all right here. It's a proudly South African meerkat, and the SKA, they're located in the Karoo. We've also documented young South Africans are involved in black hole research. At the time of writing in 2019, he was a Rhodes student, and he wrote code for simulation of what they would see when they had the telescope looking into the sky. This month in 22, a Wits postdoc was involved with his supervisor in capturing the image that we see there of the huge Milky Way black hole. Next slide, please. So these two cosmologists have inspiring messages to the youth. This one is by Hawking, and he says, remember to look up to the stars and not down at your feet. Try to make sense of what you see and wonder about what makes the universe exist. Be curious, and however difficult life may seem, there is always something you can do and succeed at. It matters that you don't give up. Unleash your imagination and shape the future. Now, similarly, this week, Maranoff, who was actually the scientist, a South African, who found the location where the SKA should be built, he wrote that we decided very early on that we had to focus on getting the young people into science and making sure we could develop them. I think you, as young people, are actually in a golden age of astronomy, and I really envy you and the other young people who are coming into astronomy. Now you've got the meerkat, and you'll soon have the SKA, which will be a wonderful telescope. So we have it here in South Africa. I think that's a very good. Thank you. If you could have the next slide, please. I'll now hand over to them.
So this brings us through to the last part of the book, which is really about reflecting on Africa's new dawn. So we argue that the time might be ripe to imagine a new African dawn across the continent. The so-called Great Reset envisages a global society that addresses problems that are laid bare during the pandemic, hopes to build a far more fairer and sustainable future for society, especially for its youth and young generations. Sub-Saharan, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa, can and probably must draw on its many strengths and virtues to become the hopeful continent, drawing particularly on its history of remarkable resilience that Valerie described, as well as the extraordinary optimism that we see. Next slide. The idea that there's always something new out of Africa. This is about representation by the world of Africa. What we've seen over time is more upbeat representation in the reporting coming through, particularly in the 2010s. If you look at just the titles of those cover pages. But the COVID-19 has produced something of a reversal and has begun to raise fundamental question marks about long COVID and the pattern of economic, particularly the casualty of economic growth. Is the engine going to slow down or not? So there are question marks emerging, but generally there's been a much more positive representation of what's happening across the continent. Next slide. So we really want to move on from this idea, particularly the economist's representation of Africa as a hopeless continent. We want to talk about the hopeful continent. People in the continent have perfected resilience. They have coped with various forms of adversity, like setbacks in life, as well as dealing with the everyday hassles emanating from poor infrastructure. They've also overcome crises, including pandemics, AIDS, Ebola, etc. And they have emerged stronger to cope with the new challenges that face them. Next slide. In terms of past resilience, I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. Let's just talk about one of the things Valerie talked about, looking to the stars, but we're also looking very much to understanding better where we've come from. So indigenous knowledge systems have helped ancient societies in Africa to deal with the shock of illness and pandemics. And African societies have always tended to adopt strategies to deal with these health shocks, including the burning of settlements as a disinfectant and shifting settlements to new locations. Southern African communities also realized that outbreaks were unpredictable, so that had an influence on the settlement patterns, which tend to be built in a dispersed fashion. In ancient societies, people really organized themselves in ways that made it much easier to live with the outbreak of disease. Life did not stop because of pandemics. The populations made fundamental choices and decisions to live with them and get beyond them. And you'll recognize that image from this weekend's paper about the young archaeologists who are pioneering this research. Next slide. The other aspect to emphasize, but I'm not going to deliberate on, is about the fundamental resilience of women. I think Sarah Barton is a classic example from this province. And also the whole idea of the well-known phrase of strike a woman is to strike a rock, something that emerged from the march, the widespread marches and protest action against caste wars in the mid-50s. Next slide. This is perhaps one of the most key images that I want to leave you with. And that's the fundamental aspect that Sub Saharan African is essentially optimistic. And this may be part of our resilience and part of our coping strategies. It's particularly evident amongst our youth. So if you look at the blue bars, this is a rating on a 0 to 10 scale. How would you rate your life today on this ladder from 0 to 10? And you can see the range between around the 4 to 5 mark. So it's not particularly positive. So quite unhappy about the lived experience of today. If we look at the red bars, which is about the future, how do you think things are going to be in the next 5 to 10 years? You can see that there's quite a big jump. And so we look towards a positive future. And we have particular expectations of a more positive change. The right-hand graph just shows that across all countries, or most countries in the region, you see that the blue line exceeds the red line, which means the blue line is about the future, the red line the present. So it's a common pattern. No matter how negatively you rate the present, we do see a gain and an expectation of future positive change. Next slide. So pulling it through to a conclusion is, in terms of imagining future sub-Saharan well-being, you see that good governance improves services and infrastructure for individuals and societal well-being. The youth bulge is turned into a youth dividend. That's what we'd like to see. Drawing on this resource of youthful energy and agency. And lastly, also about opportunities are opened up for livelihoods in fields such as modern agriculture, in industry, and smart technology. Next slide, and this is the last one. Hope has the last word for youth happiness. So the history of well-being in Africa, south of the Sahara, is really one of this resilience combined with hope of better times to come. Sub-Saharan's greatest asset is its youthful drive and creativity. If this energy is put to work, we may see prosperity and happiness for future generations to come. So thank you, and happy Africa Day today, and happy Youth Day for June 16th. Thank you very much. Over to you, Cyril.
Oh, I'm back online now. You can actually see me from everywhere, Tamrin. Can everyone see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Fantastic, thank you. When you said hope is happiness, I just remember a lecture by one of the Canadian academics. He's a psychologist, I think, and he believes that responsibility is also a measure of a life with purpose, and the youth is less likely to become depressed if they take on responsibility. So, yeah, it's a very, very insightful day. Thank you so much for the presentation. And then, Tom, would you please start loading your presentation? You know, as you were talking, colleagues, I just you know, at the back of my head, I wondered if it's really a bad thing to have the youth migrating to Europe. Well, that's the problem. If low-skilled youth is migrating to Europe, and then they're able to send their money back home and build their mother's houses, it's the case with the youth. And when they get there, they can make their money, they can invest into their local currencies, they can actually build infrastructure back home. Whether the problem are EU immigration laws, in which basically cost them back as they're trying to cross over. And I'm not talking about highly skilled youth that are taking these chances is so bad. And then it's a thought that just at the back of my mind, but I really loved the I think it was Mark Bertrand, or someone who said innovations, the youth of Africa is excited about innovations that are not just novelty, but actually practical and useful. So, not creating apps for Instagram, but actually creating drones that can spread seeds for agriculture, those kinds of innovations. But yeah, so I see that Tom is online now. Tom, Tom only has got 2 slides, so you all here, for those who are present, you will all just yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Thanks. Thanks, Prof. Can you hear me?
Yeah, just hold on. I'll put your slide. Yeah. All right,
Okay.
go ahead.
Yes. Well, thank you. This is really an honor and a privilege to respond to this really beautiful book. I have really enjoyed going through, and I mean, it goes to a question around social well-being that goes way back in as far as questions Aristotle and Plato, who consider humans as social beings and develop theories of the virtuous life and the good life, and we see it come into modern policy in the welfare state. And both social well-being and social cohesion imply, I guess, a sense of togetherness, resilience, and an orientation towards a common good. And this book speaks strongly towards this theme and the evidence that living in a cohesive society has a positive impact on subjective well-being, helping to improve the lives of citizens. And from Durkheim to Parsons through social science, this has been an essential debate to try and understand the capacity of society to ensure the well-being of all of its members and minimizing disparities and avoiding marginalization. This book is a beautiful illustration of how we can do this, looking in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa. And the first 6 chapters, it provides a range of ways of doing this, and a review of social progress focused on basic needs, health and education, in which it also speaks back to the colonial and cultural legacies and the diversity and resilience of the continent. But I think it's very generous in its broader historical view, speaking to health questions of the pandemic, the history of health interventions, speaking to economic and educational questions of social mobility and development, speaking to the history of governance and shifting institutional regimes and attitudes to democracy as a work in progress, and citizen evaluations of good governance. And it speaks back to the history and trajectory of policy making and the issue of the youth bulge and the challenges of environmental pressures and rising discontent. And at the same time then goes on to speak to the future and Africa's demographic time bomb and the issues of human rights, indigenous people, women, LGBTI, refugees, and decolonization. And then finally to the optimistic innovations and technological solutions. And in part 3, as it speaks to the new African dawn as an unfinished story, we get back to the trajectory of some social research in a sense from which it has come, and it brings this very broad perspective which gives us this overview. And I think this is very important because within the field over the last decade, there's many studies that have focused upon the positive effect of social institutional trust on social well-being and on social capital and things of this nature from a cross-sectional and longitudinal sort of stance. But what's increasingly, I think, needed is this more reflexive and well-rounded type of approach that this book, I think, demonstrates with its contextual and thought through sort of understanding of these many facets. And I think it also speaks to the fact that maybe current definitions of the good life and social well-being or social cohesion don't often cover the multiplicity of values and cultures found in current societies, and often then reproduce forms of marginalization. And we see that in current societies, the way they're being governed and shaped around constructs can also contribute to conflict and fragmentation, and indeed from a decolonial perspective, modern social science can also be a kind of a carrier or a vector of this ambivalent relationship between social progress and regression. And this book helps us to see that it is often the absence of African knowledge and scholarship about some of these questions that is maybe notable and instructional for us here. And it is in this sense, this book, I think, feels to me greatly valuable and readable, and a brilliant attempt to provide that empirical and theoretical grounding, you know, for political and economic questions of well-being and happiness, and by implication, questions around social well-being and cohesion across Africa, using a very wide range of tools and empirical data. And in this sense, I felt that this was a great example, as this Kento cloth shows, of weaving a story. And I think this is important for providing that very deep understanding. And I think that it has helped to provide a great entry point for future research. So it continues to suggest, I think, that we need to continue to formulate new measurements of well-being to guide policy making and research that focuses on identifying the causes and the understanding the relationships between the environment, colonial past, the economy, and the long trends, and developing more finer cutting-edge measurements of well-being, and to help policymakers think these questions through. And the book shows that is important because it connects up many pathways for the future, showing how events like COVID-19, climate change, and the clash of generations impact upon social well-being. And here I've chosen this intersecting pathways of change as a little metaphor, and I feel the book has beautifully cleared a path for new research that provides evidence on maybe a recalibrated relationship between the market, state, and society, and upon social well-being in Africa for scholars in the future. And it works to do this at a number of levels: the level of the community, the nation state, the individual, and the level of institutions. And it explores these levels via many different paths of change. And I feel that it's not common to see research, I think, on social well-being that is so generously open and wide-ranging to cover these levels in such a way. And for that reason, I think it provides a really important entry point for the road ahead and for investing in health and education, and provides hopeful scenarios and innovations, and an entry point for intergenerational dialogue and policy responses to address issues for future generations, questions around lived poverty and the youth dividend and skills training, the brain drain, all come together. In the roundedness of this book, I think it's very, very welcome, and it is what happens at the intersection of these things, together with the cross-sectional longitudinal analysis, that really, I think, is practical in informing potential policy making and understanding of creative and constructive ways ahead. And I think in particular, to enable future research to rethink social mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion, and questions of development that are important for the expansion of inclusive protection systems against vulnerabilities and social risks. And at the end of the book, it ends by looking at how the crisis created by the COVID-19 pandemic should be used as an opportunity to realize the region's potential. So I think this book invites us to do this by taking into consideration the notion of well-being that is grounded within an empirical study of the continent and the trajectory of social policy making within countries within it. And I am, as a PhD student, find it extremely readable and a very welcome addition to scholarship. And yes, commend the authors for writing it.
Oh, thanks so much. Okay, great. Sorry about that. Technology innovation required from African youth there. So we said that we will start off with the our colleagues, everybody online, in responding. But maybe you would like to respond to anything that Ben said. If there was a question there, I think it was all comments from Ben's side. So maybe it's better if we just go to people in the audience too. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, fantastic. Yes, thank you so much, and thanks for the. Somebody did say that they loved the way that you've covered the continent, giving the history of the continent. I wonder if Tamrin, you could read that that comment. And yeah, so maybe Tamrin, you can take us through the questions from the first one. I don't see because I only joined halfway. So maybe if you can just go through all the questions for us, is that possible? How many questions do we have? Maybe that's what I should ask.
We have a few that have come through. If we can maybe look at the question from Ndalwa, where she says, you've touched a bit on the role of Indigenous community. Did you look at Indigenous knowledge systems with the connection to African well-being and the happiness of its people?
Okay. I don't know if you did hear okay, Valerie didn't hear that. Let me just try and read it again. You touched a bit on the role of Indigenous communities. Did you look at IKS, Indigenous Knowledge Systems, IKS connection to African well-being and the happiness of its people?
In the book, we didn't look, but we thought that the link between Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous religions that are important for promoting well-being. And at the moment, I'm working with colleagues in botany and in anthropology who are looking precisely at this, the link between nature and spirituality. So I think it is very important. Mm-hmm. But in the book, we didn't go into depth.
Okay. Just to add to that, we did give certain examples throughout of the development of tools and other, in response, even the settlement patterns, in response to particular climatic challenges. So the adaptations and the knowledge that came through that, I think, is reflected. But a wide-ranging book, it's tough to go in depth. But it is sort of, if you read certain sections, it does jump out the role of IKS in different aspects. And I think it's, as we said earlier on, the recognition, the inherent, and the decolonisation in particular, the recognition of the inherent value of IKS and so local community knowledge is increasingly playing a role, even in South Africa with the Department of Science and Innovation. It's been a core focus of theirs for the better part of 2 decades at least. So there's something that's firmly on the agenda and is obviously linked to communities thriving and also promoting the kind of well-being and happiness that we're talking about.
Okay, I don't see a lot of people. So can we just bring Ola? Are you happy to for us to read your question, or let me see? Or would you be happy if we if you just speak for yourself? Let me see if we can do it for you. I'll allow your mic, so you can, unless you want to also just show your picture. Are you able to do that? Well, I was asking about the impact of social media. What, are you still there? Okay, so what, yeah, so he's, if you are able to bring all on the platform, please do so, Tandri. Otherwise, for now, I'll just read his comment. First, he said, thank you for such an excellent overview of the continent. Did you consider the impact of social media on well-being in Africa?
Can I take a first step at that, Tandri? Yeah. So I think it does come through. I think as I described in the latter part of my presentation, social media has been formed a fundamental tool for mobilization, particularly mobilization of youth, and taking the discontent that we saw. Discontent shouldn't always be framed as a negative. You know, the ability to freely express that discontent and hold the elected leaders and officials to account is part of the inherent lived experience of democracy. So a tool that allows to ensure that mobilization happens, and that happens on a broader scale than without the existence of that social media is critical. It promotes awareness, it promotes, forms as a way to bring people together for a common purpose. That is why we've seen efforts in more authoritarian countries around the continent to try and repress that social media. It's why we have these outages. In times of protest, there's a time to have social media blackouts. Another potential negative is the role of misinformation, and obviously we've had big conversations about that during the pandemic, and the questions about fake news, about echo chambers, and so on, reinforcing particular worldviews. So there are potential negatives to the social media. The reality is that we depend on those who are online to have reasonably good skills in differentiating fake from the real news and looking to fact check some of the things that they see online. But certainly, I think the benefits and positive impact of social media far outweighs the negative potential of some of the examples I gave.
It's also an example of the power, you might say, a new tool, the cell phone, which offers social media. And as we're trying to demonstrate the disconnect, that social media can be clamped down during times when authoritarian governments are not in touch with the needs of the people and with the youth themselves.
We've seen it even in the Ukraine-Russia war at the moment, where the Putin administration is really trying to clamp down on the social media with varying degrees of success. But, so it's trying to keep the public in the dark, to reinforce the Russian sort of image of wider of with Ukraine. So there is attempts to clamp down on the flow of information and the representation of what's going on.
And we have Elon Musk, who's provided satellites to help the Ukrainians to keep in touch with what is happening. So.
Thank you so much. Sibusiso Nyanda, excuse my late arrival. What time do you have? Glad to be here as a guest representing the creative and cultural industry, as it is a sleeping giant in the economic contribution and virile economic well-being of creatives. I'm not sure if there's a question. If you've got a question, you can just also put it there. And then, so let me just see. And then Christopher, how did you see the interaction between gender dynamics?
Well, I don't have a question at this point, but it was just interesting for me to be here. Sorry for my late arrival, but
okay,
I'm
so
glad to just keep on listening to the contributions, because I might have something to add on, as the creative industries have also been identified as contributors to general well-being of sub-Saharan communities. It's just that the creative industry is not necessarily most of the time seen as how can I say, a big player in contributing to economic wellness in this case, or social wellness in this case. So it would be nice for me to just carry on listening what is actually being said out here in this space, and I'll give a little bit of input in as far as what we've been doing in the creative industry space, in as far as bringing things into light, trying to make sure that the industry contributes to general wellness.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. I think we've seen during the lockdowns in COVID, also internationally, but here in South Africa, how the creative industries have become so creative in trying to keep going and to support each other. And it's really been very inspiring. So also there are so many skills that need to be developed and support. And maybe some of the tensions that we've seen at the end of the ministry for sports is combined with the creative, the arts and the culture, that maybe this doesn't work so well unless they can support each other, you know, to link together. So I think it's very important because young people are, they have also been entrepreneurs in creating new spaces to express themselves and also to make livelihoods.
Actually, we were having
No, thank you very much.
yesterday at the Human Science Research Council about different forms or different dimensions of democracy. One which actually came up was cultural democracy and the importance of the cultural dimension in terms of that we need to celebrate, that are critically important to understanding the process and also remembering the past. And obviously contributing, as you've indicated, to the economic well-being of society, the richness and diversity of what we want democracy to be. So I think I'm glad you raised it because it's something that we do need to emphasise, you know, particularly in the recent challenges that South Africa and the continent has been facing, you know, focusing on the arts and the creatives.
Of course, we know that the creatives, the arts, music, arts, culture, and everything does promote well-being. So
Yes,
It's probably part of the resilience as well.
yeah, resistance. So
There is a study, though.
Resistance and resilience. It helps us get by.
Interestingly enough,
we would have, for the people who attended, we can get a copy of the book. So, and of the e-book, unfortunately not this one, I have copy part of the e-book. Bulelani's email address, can you please put it there on the chat? I think that would be the best way to manage it. So you can send Bulelani, can you please put your email address on the chat so everybody can just use that email to ask for the e-book. All right, moving on. Chanmin, can you see a question that I am not seeing? Otherwise, we go to the colleagues who are here present with us.
You were going to do Chris DeVet's question? The
Oh, yes.
Between gender dynamics and well-being.
Yes, Chris DeVet, do you want to come online or are you happy if you read it? Yeah, just unmute Chris there. I'm not sure if I can do it on my side.
is Chris DeVet an anthropologist according to her?
Is Chris there? Can you hear us, colleagues?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. I just wanted to ask how in terms of your research, the relationship between gender dynamics and well-being happiness comes out. Thank you.
Well, we do find, say, differences in life satisfaction between genders, but it does depend very much on the context. And then across domains, you will find that there are differences because of maybe different needs in terms of family life or work life. But generally, demographics are not that important for life satisfaction. It's quite different.
Okay, moving on, colleagues here in the room, I'm going to start with you. And well, maybe I should just open it up. Who's got a question? Anyone with a question here? Do you want a comment? Question? Yes, go ahead. You can introduce yourself, where you're from, and then state your question.
Okay, my name is Sangyam Mugati. I'm from, I'm a master's graduate from the Institute Department. I thank you for your presentation. Sorry. Thank you for the presentation. I think my questions when I was listening to your presentation, there's I think one or two questions. My first question would be on, I noticed with your social media presentation, Ethiopia had a decline in their phone usages. So there, I saw that on the graphic, decline. I wanted to know what were your observations and interests in terms of that. And then in terms of your your conversation around cost of living, and how that also there's a discontent in there. For me, I was thinking back to the Grahamstown last year in terms of infrastructure, where there's like the protests around roads and water and ESCOM. Does infrastructure play a role in discontent, or is that something that goes with governance and how municipalities deliver their service delivery as general governance? And I think my last more like comment in terms of what I've seen on your last line in terms of the resilience of women. And I've noticed on social media there's now the trajectory more maybe I speak to the South African context. I'm quite involved in gender-based violence and movements and stuff like that. There's that conversation around the whole Imbogodo is like now in social media there's now a turnaround of like we need to be treated. Those of us that want to be treated as soft and delicate should be allowed to be treated softly. We shouldn't be treated, not all of us want to be treated as a rock kind of thing. I don't know if they have thoughts around that perspective on resilience of women as well. So those are my three questions. Thank you.
The resilience of women, I think that was on minorities. We actually, the idea that women want to be the way they want either soft or strong or something. And there were just some, you might say, sort of vignettes that we included. And one was of the women who wanted to be on their own, and they created a community of women. And they came from countries, and there was sort of a sidetrack. The woman, the journalist who interviewed them, she found many went from their villages because they wanted to escape gender mutilation, which you might say is also part of this. And so they were self-contained, and they had goats or something, they had industry, and during COVID, they sold beads or something, to tourists. And during COVID, they sort of moved out and, to keep sustaining when they couldn't do this. The interesting thing is that men who visited they decided if they're allowed to stay overnight. And they did take on men's roles, they protected. So these are just sort of examples that women are doing. They want to be the way they were and not the way they're sort of portrayed that they should be in their particular society. Just one vignette, you might say. There are many more.
Colleagues, we will be, unfortunately, we ran out of time. Does anybody want to have a quick thing? Okay, so we are closing off. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Very rich discussion, rich presentation, very detailed from Valerie and Ben. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thanks to Tom as well. Great response. I just want to say the ISR will be loading the recording of this seminar on our YouTube channel, so you can revisit, and then there you can also follow up on the discussions. You can put your comments there, then we'll just forward them to you to respond, just to keep the discussion ongoing. I would like to thank everybody who's come and attended online. We had more people online by far. And who are actually at roads comes to the venue. But thank you so much. I guess everybody feels it's still safer to attend online. Much appreciated. Thank you. And thanks to those who also came to the ISER. For those who were brave enough to come to the ISER, we're going to head off to have tea and biscuits. Maybe the next time people at Rose could be enticed by those incentives in future. But otherwise, thanks to the ISER team. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. Until next time.